Sorry. Hey everyone, David here with another development update for my sci-fi indie game, Arcadian Rift. Despite playing a little bit of Cyberpunk this month, I actually got a ton of cool new features and tasks done, so let's just jump right into it. I began by finishing up some of the things I didn't quite get to last month with the salvage freighter. The cargo cranes now slowly move back and forth to add some life to the scene as well as allow the player to have some jumping mechanics. The crushers move a bit faster and now actually damage the player at the right moments. The conveyor belts have been updated to have a moving texture, so they actually look like they're conveyor belts. I modeled some small scrap pieces and created a particle system in Niagara, which drops them out of the big droppers into the bins below. I spent a bit of time learning Cascade as well to modify the default fire system to create a flame burst for the flamethrowers. I even made it kind of fit the design I was going for, where there's a small igniting flame that goes off first, so the player knows it's about to fire. The flamethrowers also deal damage as well. Overall, I was really happy with how this effect turned out. The color dynamics are really cool, and it leaves a nice kind of heat distortion effect after the flames subside. I also learned a lot about kind of the particle systems in Unreal, which I've been trying to work on. After this, I started working on creating some actual models for all the light sources on the ship. Previously, lamps were just kind of placed in Unreal, and the light was just coming out of nowhere. But now I've got various models for spotlights, floodlights, point lights, hanging on walls, all these different things. I even set it up such that I can change the color and brightness of the light source dynamically per instance without needing to make tons of materials, which gives me full creativity when actually placing the lights in the scene. I used this opportunity to spend a bit more time lighting the scene, adding some color variety, and finishing some areas that were dark, hard to see, or kind of hard to navigate. I then wanted to add just a bit more decorations to place around the ship to make them feel a bit fuller. I modeled a few large props like fence walls, railings, and bridges, which help the player kind of navigate these big container yards. I also made some small props like barrels, barricades, cones, a cool server bank, which might be responsible for some of the kind of onboard equipment. One of the more dynamic pieces was an air vent, which is blowing visible air using the same heat distortion effect I learned on the flamethrower, which then pushes the player up to higher levels easily. I also expanded the amount of loot crates to open by adding rigging and animating 2 new ones. I thought it was getting a little repetitive opening the same ones, even for testing purposes. So we have one new one which is based around the design I made for the fridge crate earlier, but it's kind of a single crate version. And the other one is a design from one of Flair's environment concepts. And in addition to these loot crates, I also made a health and ammo crate, which always give the player at least health or ammo. So finally there are now ways to get health and ammo without just killing enemies. This was another one of those things I was going to do for a long time. Finally, it was time to start expanding the gameplay of the mission itself. What seemed to be lacking most were enemies, so I began by making a basic turret, which I knew I was going to want eventually. These are just the real basic enemies that just add like some extra danger, nothing particularly special about them. It's literally like it's the baseline thing that attacks you. I also made a missile version of the turrets a bit later when designing the missiles for the heavy drone, which I'll be talking about in just a moment. One useful feature I added when designing the turrets, which I then added to all my other AI and will continue to add, is a little look-ahead function. This was always, again, one of those things I was planning, but just never implemented until now. The enemies actually lead their shots when the player is moving, meaning you can't just strafe sideways like before and just dodge all their shots. After the turret, I had 2 real basic enemies, and I thought it time to try one of the more dynamic enemies and really push how much I knew about the AI, animation, and behaviors. I modeled the heavy drone based off Flair's concept, but tried to adapt it a bit to the existing drone, tank, and turret, as well as allow for the specific gameplay I was going to want with it. After rigging it, creating all the various animations for moving and firing, I set up the AI behaviors, animation blends, and got everything almost ready. All that was left were the missiles. The missiles are just a real basic model, but the idea is that they have some randomness to their trajectory and kind of zigzag around a bit. That way, when you fire them in a cluster, it creates some unpredictability in exactly where the missiles will hit. I also created a fun particle trail system in Niagara. Once again, trying to learn more about these particle systems I enjoy particles a lot, and I like effects, but I'm finding it's a little different than the particle systems I'm used to. Once that was all in, the heavy drone was complete, and this enemy is a lot more different than the standard drone. That's what it says here in my script. It's a lot more different than the standard drone. Rather than advancing towards the player, it kind of holds its ground a lot more and fires from a distance. And the main feature is it fires these missile barrages with a little cooldown. I think it's about 8 seconds right now. And the barrage itself can be way more devastating than just the normal attacks. The design behind this was to very clearly signal to the player when the barrage was coming. The cannons go away, the top folds out, the drone begins shaking harder and harder, and then suddenly it releases all the missiles. So by kind of watching it, you can tell it's about to fire. And there will, of course, eventually be sound design that's also going to really help the player. And the idea of this was that the player sees and hears the missiles about to come out, and then you need to kind of think about being a little more defensive rather than being offensive for a moment. So hopefully the gameplay and combat's going to start changing up a little more and feeling a little more diverse, and won't just always be run around, shoot everything until it dies. One small new behavior I created with the heavy drone was a random roam near start behavior. Previously, the enemies would just wander randomly throughout the whole map. Now the enemies will stay near where they're supposed to be, or at least where where they started, where I place them in the level when they wander around, which is good for designing out the kind of flow and encounters of a level. You don't want all the enemies bunching up one area. You want to kind of come into a room and have a certain amount of enemies you fight in that room. After all this work with enemies, I wanted to expand on the door system a bit, as that's how the player's going to be progressing through the level to more challenging and rewarding areas. The first task was to redesign the key system to be more obvious that the key belongs in the slot, so new players would know what to do without needing a tutorial, and the new design should definitely be an improvement over before. Next, I created a one-sided door, which seems surprisingly simple, but actually wasn't working before. Basically, it's just a door that you can only open from one side. That way I can use these doors to lead the players like from the final room back to the starting room, but they won't be able to go from the starting room to the final room right at the beginning. And finally, I added a door that gets powered up with the lasers in the same way that the loot crate was powered up with the lasers. It was at this point that I was about halfway through the month, and I was thinking about how I wanted to get some people kind of playing the game early on, getting a feel for things, letting me know, how the game feels. But one thing I knew I wasn't really happy with was the actual gameplay in combat. Currently, you could only choose between 2 weapons. When you're in your armory back in the ship, you pick your primary, you pick your secondary. These are the ones you bring in the mission. You would always have your Q cannon as your third, and the fourth would be a scanner that, at the moment, still doesn't do anything. So this didn't really allow for much interesting combat or interesting choices. It was just kind of shoot, you take cover, reload, shoot, run. There wasn't really much happening, and I was starting to get kind of worried that I didn't want this game to just be kind of a meh shooter game, sci-fi. I wanted to actually kind of make it feel a little more interesting, let the player kind of have some choices, have some different mechanics they can take advantage of. So I spent a bit of time considering kind of alternatives and brainstorming ideas, had some other people help out with brainstorming, and before going forward, I wanted to have some idea that I thought was going to work a little better, and really push that. So I've now separated weapons and gadgets as 2 separate things. Weapons are fired with your left mouse button, and gadgets are fired with your right mouse button. Similar to something if you've played like BioShock Infinite, where you can use an ability mid-combat to kind of spice up the gameplay. This made a lot of improvements to the game. Like, number 1, you always have a weapon and a gadget you can use at any time. You don't have to like switch to a gadget. It's not like before when you're shooting, no one's going to be like shooting and then switch to their Q cannon, grab something, throw it, and switch back. That's the kind of thing like game designers think would be cool, but players aren't going to do that. Now you can actually, at any one moment, you can always be shooting and then grab something and immediately keep shooting with just your left and right click. 2, it allows for the player to carry, we're deciding at the moment, up to 4 weapons, up from previously you're only really choosing between 2 weapons. So no longer will you have, this big armory of weapons on your ship, most of which just kind of sit around unused. And 3, having 4 weapons and 3 ability slots, which is what we're thinking at the moment, means you still need to kind of choose to leave behind some weapons or abilities, but now there's much more flexibility on how you build your character for the mission. Which abilities do you want to mix with which weapons? And finally, number 4, we thought it'd be cool to start the player with just 2 weapon slots and 1 ability slot. First, to kind of, slowly teach the player the game. Don't give them tons of abilities and weapons they're trying to fiddle with at once. But also, now the player can kind of unlock more slots as the game goes on, which was something that we definitely need. There's definitely a need to have more items to buy with money that you're getting, the in-game money, not real-life money, which is then also kind of doubles up with, like, the player can kind of choose as they're going through the game, do I want to really carry 3 weapons at once? I have these 3 weapons I really want. Should I get a new weapon slot, or should I get, like, a new ability slot? Obviously, eventually you'll be able to get them all, but the kind of order you progress can be a little more up to the player now. With that, I decided the first thing I should do would be, before even working on the abilities themselves, would be to update the HUD design, as that would kind of dictate a bit of the design of the abilities, how many I'd have, what buttons I'd use and stuff, how I'd switch between all the weapons and abilities. And the HUD in general has been long overdue to have some actual work put into it. Everything was just temporary up to this point. After going through a lot of different design ideas and looked at tons of reference on how different games arrange and display their HUD, I came to one I was pretty happy with. Top left corner are your abilities and how much charge you have available to use your abilities, and then mirroring this on the right are your weapons and how much ammo you have, and bottom left is of course your health and shields. I also found an open source font I was really happy with called Techo, which I'm slowly rolling out to the game, so it's no longer the really kind of cheap basic fonts that come with Unreal. After breaking apart the HUD design into components and bringing them in piece by piece, I figured out how to do a cool effect I thought would look nice and help the HUD from looking kind of flat and cheap, which was add a slight curve effect dynamically in Unreal, which wraps everything, including all the text and effects and everything that Unreal's adding. And I kept it a little subtle, but it definitely it makes it look less cheap, I think, in my opinion. Hopefully you feel that way as well. I also did a lot of optimizations to the HUD, such as rewriting a lot of the functions to not update every single frame, but only when they're needed. I moved the HUD kind of fade in to work on the overall retainer box, yada yada. Just a lot of little optimizations here and there that player probably won't notice, but things are getting better. I made the HUD actually for 4K, so now all the artwork is designed for 4K. Everything, it won't be like scaling up. Previously it was just like making random images, slapping them in, but now it's actually designed, all the elements designed at 4K, and then it just scales down from there. And this is the final result of the HUD as it is now, which might still see some small updates in the future. But one thing I'm really trying to do with this game, I'm trying to get in the habit of just taking pretty much all features I'm working on, either just do it really temp and don't worry about it like the HUD has been previously, where it's just placeholder stuff, or take it to a point that I'm happy with, so I don't have to come back to anything. I want to get everything to the point where it's like, okay, if I had to ship the game now, I'd be happy with it. With that all working, it was time to finally start working on the actual abilities. The first step was to get the Q cannon functionality moved into an ability, which was a good test case for all the kind of abilities. And after a bit of headache with the animation blending for the left and right arm, so each could have the separate kind of interpolation and blend times and stuff that it's too time-consuming to even go over, I got something that worked pretty well. It's not absolutely 100% perfect, but with all the limitations and how much I know in Unreal, it's working pretty darn well, and I like it a lot. Later in this month, I actually came back to this ability and finally added some cool VFX for when you're grabbing onto things. This is something that, I'd always planned to have the Q cannon have some cool beam that tethers things, but finally spent some time, did it. Nice spline. It feels a little more interesting, and it looks pretty cool. Next was the dash ability, which was much easier because it didn't require new animations. When the player dashes, they just move in a direction of their choosing very quickly. It's not just a forward thing. You can dash sideways, you can dash kind of up. The problem I was having is that I had to keep decreasing the amount, or the strafe dashes would just be so extreme and the player would just get lost. They'd be aiming at something to dash to the side, and suddenly the enemy's not even in their view anymore. So then I would tone the dash down, but then they dash forward and just feel weak. So of course the easy solution was just to kind of change my equation I have that calculates how far they get dash to kind of prioritize the forward, backwards, up and down strength a little more, and the sideways is strength less, and it kind of smoothly interpolates. So it actually feels way better now. When the player wants to dash forward, they go forward really strong, but when they're doing the side dashes, it's a little more subtle and nuanced, just to kind of dodge an attack, but stay kind of in combat and not lose the enemy, so far from your crosshair. And for the effects here, I went with something similar to the Doom Eternal dash, by adding some kind of blurred lines that appear around the HUD briefly, and then I scale them up as they fade out. I did want to make a little more of a kind of chromatic effect though, and thus I took this image, added some kind of color shift to it, and then in Unreal I also mimicked the kind of chromatic blurring by keyframing the chromatic aberration a bit, and finally having a subtle field of view adjustment to feel a bit more warp-like. Finally, I added the shield, which went through a bunch of design ideas that I don't actually have anymore because I kind of deleted them because I hated them so much. But what the design I finally came on was that I was happy with was using these kind of hexagonal fragments which generate in front of the player, and with a bit of trickery I also managed to dynamically unparent and reparent the shield from the arm when you put it away, which prevents it from just immediately disappearing and instead allows it to kind of play this cool closing animation. And after getting a license from Little Thomas Kid, copyright 2020, all rights reserved, to use his patented feature idea, I added a dynamic light source to both the shield and the gravity gadget, so they cast some light on the player's arms as well as the environment. With the Q-Cannon functionality now gone, the Q-Cannon had to get updated to behave like an actual weapon now. Rather than just scrapping it, it's just going to be kind of a beam-type weapon, and I can still use all the same animations and everything. However, the model had to get a slight change to make room for a magazine, as well as animate the reload. The beam is obviously super temporary, just for me to kind of figure out if I'm shooting or not. But overall, I'm really happy with the animations and the reload. I especially like when you're sustaining a beam and you run out of ammo while you're holding it down. I have this kind of unique sequence where the gun lurches forward as if suddenly, the force pushing back was removed. And one of the final things I did this month was adding a lens dirt mask, which is an effect you see a lot in games, and I really like it when used in a kind of sci-fi setting, especially in these dark interiors with bright lights. And after searching for a lot of lens dirt textures online and realizing I wasn't really happy with any of them, I created my own from scratch in Blender just by making a particle system, adding depth of field, and then doing some compositing effects and mixing it with a few other textures subtly. The end effect was something I was really happy with. You can see the difference clearly on things like the flamethrowers, which now reveal this bit of texture, and I think, like many things, it just helps add some actual texture to the scene and make the thing not to seem so flat. The bloom actually reveals it nicely. I really like that effect. And that's all for this month. Now that the abilities are all functioning and the HUD is actually, it's there, it works, I actually have just a few more weapons I want to work on, and maybe some more abilities, but then I'm hoping to push for the first round of playtesting soon. Just something real basic, just to get feedback on the actual kind of game feel, moving, jumping, shooting, using abilities, reloading, etc. Thanks again to everyone supporting me on Patreon. I did open up the Discord server this month to patrons and some close friends. If anyone is interested, it's not officially a reward or anything yet, but I thought it was nice for those who wanted to follow But I thought it was nice for those who wanted to follow the project closer. Progress closer, more closely. Whatever. I posted a lot of these pictures, but I thought it was nice for those who wanted to follow closer the project's progress. Man. I posted a lot of these pictures and GIFs in an update channel on the Discord. I post a lot of these GIFs and pictures in an update channel on the Discord. Everything's just falling apart at the end. I post a lot of these pictures and GIFs that you see in this video in an update channel on the Discord. So thanks everyone for watching, and with that, it's time to get back to work.